At the end of your 5-course ESOL endorsement, you will take a class called TESOL Methods. That class offers an overview of basic principles, practices, and methods that provide a broad foundation for educating English language learners. This mini-lecture previews what you will learn on the first day of that class, the framework that all views on teaching and learning have in common. There's an underlying approach, a guiding method, and a series of techniques. It is important that all teachers be familiar with these 3 terms, but what do they mean? The first one we'll look at is approach. Synonyms for the word approach are theory, model, or research paradigm. An approach is a general philosophy about how learners learn, and thus how teachers should teach. You may have heard of B.F. Skinner's behavioral theory of learning, also called behaviorism, or perhaps you've heard of the cognitive approach to learning. An approach is a huge category that contains many sub-ideas. All of these sub-ideas are slightly different from each other, but they all hold this philosophy of learning and teaching in common. Those sub-ideas are methods. A method is a list of procedures of precisely how to do something. That list is often referred to as a syllabus. Some methods provide their own second language acquisition theory, while others are aligned to one that already exists separately. The audio-linguistic method, or ALM, is an English as a second language teaching method that is part of the behavioral theory of learning. You'll learn about ALM in the TESOL Methods course. CALA is an English as a second language method that is part of the cognitive approach to learning. You'll learn about CALA in this class. A method is a syllabus, which means it's an inventory of things the learner should master. This inventory is sometimes presented in a recommended sequence because of the influence of second language acquisition research. That information is used to design courses and teaching materials. For example, most methods include statements about how the language should be presented, the sequencing or presentation of the language, and the amount of focus on the various language skills. This is usually based on complexity and usefulness. And finally, descriptions of specific learning activities. Each method usually recommends to us a variety of techniques to use in the classroom. A technique is a task or a classroom activity. Each method will name, define, and describe the specific learning activities, techniques, that are to be used. For example, in an ESL teaching method called task-based learning, students are required to work on projects. In another ESL teaching method, students are required to listen to classical music playing softly in the background while they lounge in Lazy Boys. If you don't believe me, just Google Suggestopedia. So, it is important to remember that these 3 terms are not synonymous. Approach is larger than method, and method is larger than technique. There may be many techniques specific to one method, and many different methods belong to one approach. In the history of foreign language learning, there's a pendulum that swings back and forth, just like in politics, where the pendulum swings back and forth between right-wing conservatives and left-wing liberals. The pendulum swings back and forth between what we teachers should focus on when we teach foreign languages. We swing back and forth between accuracy and fluency. Accuracy is the quality of language. How perfect is the language that learners produce? Fluency is the quantity of language, how much language a learner produces. This question is often a source of debate. Which foreign language student is better? The one who talks and writes a lot but makes lots of mistakes? Or the one who finally says one perfect sentence after you wait and wait and wait for it. In the early to mid-20th century, a psychologist named B.F. Skinner developed a theory of learning, an approach, that centered on the idea that humans learn through mimicry and memorization. The behavioral theory of learning believes that a person's mind is completely empty and that teachers need to fill it up. This idea is called tabula rasa, which means blank slate in Latin. According to behaviorists, language learning requires people to hear the language first. This is the stimulus. Then those hearers or learners respond by repeating what they have heard. That's the response. And finally, those hearers or learners get feedback about their output. That's the reinforcement. Here's an example. A mother shows a baby a ball, and she says, "Ball." The baby says, "Ball," and the mother gets excited and exclaims, "He said ball." That's your positive reinforcement. Another outcome might be that the baby says boo, and the mother corrects the baby and they participate in a kind of tennis match. Ball, boo, ball, boo, ball, ba, ball, ball. Thus the mimicry. ESL lessons based in the behavioral theory also involve a lot of mimicry, lots of error correction, memorization of set dialogues. Remember, no creativity allowed because of tabula rasa. And language modalities are sequenced. In other words, the method tells us how to follow, or tells us to follow nature. First you listen, then you speak, then you learn how to read, then you learn how to write. Cognitive approaches to foreign and second language learning developed in the late 20th century as a reaction to the behavioral approaches like ALM, because the goal of perfection that the behavioral approaches aspired to was viewed as unrealistic. Students will make errors. A very famous and important second language acquisition researcher we'll learn about in this class, named Stephen Krashen, tells us that errors are to be expected and used constructively in the learning process. This means that we move further away from perfection or accuracy and now focus more on communication or fluency. In this class, we'll be examining in detail one particular method called the Cognitive Academic Language Learning Approach, or CALA. This method falls under the cognitive approach to learning a foreign language. And the three techniques that must be incorporated into a CALA class are teaching students content information, teaching students relevant academic English skills, and teaching students learning strategies, which are sort of like study skills. CALA is a sheltered English method, which means that all students are non-native speakers of English receiving instruction from a content teacher. Content teachers trained in CALA are sensitive to both the language needs of the students and the language demands of the content subject. In CALA, content rather than language drives the curriculum. Language skills will be most meaningful when students perceive they will be needed in order to accomplish a communicative or academic task. You will be a sheltered English teacher when you graduate with your ESOL endorsement.